When a tear-streaked girl named Zara appears in her teacher's classroom long after dismissal, everyone believes it might be just another case of everyday stress. However, as the details fall into place, they realize the situation is far more harrowing than anyone could have imagined. Before we delve into this heartbreaking yet inspiring tale, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Be sure to like this video, subscribe for more compelling stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single update. Zara's pencil froze mid-sketch as the classroom door creaked open, and every head turned. Mrs. Callahan, the principal, stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Zara's stomach tightened. She rarely appeared without warning, and when she did, the news was never good. "Zara, I need to see you," she said, her voice calm but clipped. The room went silent. A few of the other students shot glances at one another, a couple of them smirking. Zara's heart hammered as she slid her notebook into her backpack. She avoided meeting their eyes and shuffled past her classmates, each step feeling more leaden than the last. Her mind whirled with every possible infraction, forgotten homework, or maybe someone had complained. Mrs. Callahan hardly said a word as they walked down the corridor, her heels clicking crisply on the tile, each echo loud in the otherwise empty space. Zara trailed behind, palms damp. The principal's office door loomed ahead, its frosted glass catching the late afternoon sun. When Mrs. Callahan pushed it open, Zara lingered on the threshold. Her foster parents, Walt and Melanie Parker, were sitting stiffly inside. Walt's hands rested on his knees, his jaw locked tight. Melanie clutched her purse, lips pressed together in an odd smile. Zara's pulse tripped over itself. They never came to school. Why would they be here now? "Come in, Zara," Mrs. Callahan said, motioning toward the empty chair beside Walt and Melanie. Zara sat slowly, her legs barely touching the floor. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive. Mrs. Callahan closed the door, then settled behind her desk, folding her hands neatly. Her gaze, outwardly warm, carried a hint of something else, concern, maybe even suspicion. "Zara, I wanted to speak with you because one of your teachers, Miss Palmer, has brought up a few concerns." Zara's chest constricted. Concerns? What kind of concerns? She darted a glance at Walt, who stared straight ahead, his expression carved out of stone. Melanie's forced smile remained, but the tension in her knuckles, clutching her purse, was visible. Zara couldn't look at Mrs. Callahan. "Miss Palmer mentioned a few things, some bruises and how withdrawn you've been," Mrs. Callahan continued gently. "She's worried you may be struggling at home. Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" Zara's throat felt raw, as though it were coated in grit. She parted her lips, but no words came. Walt shifted, and Zara glimpsed the subtle narrowing of his eyes, a silent order. Melanie's hand reached out and rested on Walt's forearm, a small gesture that warned, "Don't step out of line." "I'm fine," Zara managed at last, her voice nearly inaudible. Mrs. Callahan angled her head, as if urging her to talk further. "Zara, it's all right. If something isn't right, you can tell me. We only want to be sure you're safe." Walt cleared his throat, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. "Mrs. Callahan, I appreciate your concern, but Zara's been through a great deal. Transitioning to a new home is never easy, and we're doing everything possible to help her adjust." Melanie nodded right away, a sugary tone filling her voice. "Oh yes, Zara is an amazing girl, but she's still learning to trust us. These things take time, don't they, honey?" She directed her gaze toward Zara, her smile tightening. The term honey jabbed at Zara's chest like a knife. Zara forced a quick nod, fingers knotting themselves in her lap. Mrs. Callahan looked from one face to another, her mouth set in a straight line. "Zara, do you feel safe at home?" Walt's jaw tensed visibly. Zara felt his stare practically burning into her, so she focused on the floor, her own voice no louder than a whisper. "Yes." The room seemed to freeze. Mrs. Callahan leaned back in her chair, watching them intently. Eventually she exhaled. "All right. But Zara, please remember that if you ever need to talk, my door's always open. Don't hesitate, okay?" Zara nodded once more. The tightness in her throat wouldn't let her speak. As they stepped out of the office, Walt gripped Zara's shoulder firmly. He leaned in, his voice low and frosty. "We'll discuss this later," he muttered, his fingers digging in like claws. That night, Zara sat on her bed, eyes fixed on the thin band of light under her door. Faintly, she heard Walt and Melanie downstairs, voices clashing in heated argument. "You're overspending, Walt," Melanie snapped. "We're barely making ends meet." "Oh, don't start with that," Walt retorted, his words soaked in irritation. "We're fine as long as we've got the girl. The checks keep rolling in. What's your problem?" "It's not just money," Melanie hissed back. "It's her. She's going to bring trouble if we're not careful. Did you notice the way that principal kept looking at us?" Walt let out a harsh laugh. "Let them look. Who's going to believe some foster kid over us? We're the perfect family, remember?" Zara's hands quaked as she clung to the only picture she had of her biological family, hidden under her mattress. The edges were ragged, the colors faded, but it was all she had left of her real home. She gazed at her mother's radiant smile, and at her father's strong arms, holding her as a toddler. "I miss you," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. She wondered whether remaining silent was the safest choice. The next morning, the bell sounded for a new school day, but Miss Palmer couldn't shake her anxiety about yesterday. During the short meeting in the principal's office, she had noticed the tension in Zara's stance and how Walt and Melanie had smoothly sidestepped each question. None of it felt right then, and it felt no better now. Zara slipped into class late, settling into a seat at the back. Her hair was untidy, her shirt wrinkled as if thrown on in a haste. Miss Palmer saw the dark shadows under her eyes. She never lifted her gaze as the lesson commenced. "All right, let's continue from where we left off yesterday," Miss Palmer announced, pacing around as students began their tasks. She caught sight of Zara's pencil moving slowly across her paper, head bent low. Something was off. She could sense it. When the class was released for recess, Miss Palmer asked Zara to remain behind. "Hey, Zara, could you stay for a minute? I need to talk to you." She hesitated, then nodded, trudging up to Miss Palmer's desk. She stood awkwardly, fidgeting with her backpack strap. "How are you doing today?" Miss Palmer asked, voice kind but concerned. "I'm fine," Zara answered too quickly, too abruptly. Miss Palmer folded her hands, her tone quieter. "Zara, if something's bothering you, you can tell me, you know. I'm here for that." Zara nodded again, but said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the exit as though she were counting seconds to leave. Miss Palmer decided not to push for more. "All right, you can go," she said, offering a gentle smile. "But remember, I'm right here if you need me." "Thanks," Zara mumbled, scurrying out. Later that day, Miss Palmer sat in the teacher's lounge at lunchtime, her notepad open. She began piecing together the subtle issues she'd noticed about Zara: unwillingness to participate in group activities, sitting alone, wearing worn clothes. She also recalled times Zara arrived late or seemed overtired, and one troubling remark about her foster parents not wanting to spend extra money on food. "Zara's been on your mind a lot, hasn't she?" said Mrs. Delgado, a math teacher, sipping her coffee. Miss Palmer hesitated, then nodded. "I just sense something's off. Have you caught anything?" Mrs. Delgado thought for a second. "Well, she's always quiet in my class. Rarely speaks unless I call on her. Looks tired sometimes, but I assumed it was normal middle school stuff." Ms. Palmer pressed gently, "What about breakfast? Does she ever come to your first period hungry?" Mrs. Delgado frowned. "Now you mention it, yes. She's been spaced out a few mornings. She doesn't eat with the other kids either, just sits there." Ms. Palmer jotted it down, her instincts firming up. "Thank you, that helps." As the lunch break ended, Ms. Palmer promised herself she'd keep an even closer eye on Zara, but she realized mere observations might not suffice. Walt and Melanie came across as way too polished. They'd deny everything if they had the chance. At dismissal, Miss Palmer watched from the main entrance. She spotted Zara waiting near the gates, backpack dangling, posture slumped, eyes on the ground. Moments later, a shiny black sedan pulled up, and Walt emerged, dressed sharply in a neatly pressed shirt, polished shoes flashing in the sunlight. "Hey, champ," Walt called in a warm, cheerful tone. Zara cringed slightly but walked over to the car without a word. Miss Palmer observed how she kept her head down, refusing eye contact as Walt placed a hand on her shoulder. Something about that grip seemed too tight, too assertive. Miss Palmer's eyes narrowed. Walt's demeanor felt calculated, like he was putting on a show. Zara climbed into the front seat, and Walt scanned the area before getting in himself. The car sped away, leaving Miss Palmer with a deepening sense of unease. Back in her small apartment that evening, Miss Palmer sat at her desk, jotting down more notes. Zara's late arrival, her withdrawn manner, and the unsettling scene during pickup. She paused, then wrote a quick note. Zara avoids looking at Walt, seems anxious. Walt's charm feels unnatural. She leaned back, studying the string of minor details that, together, painted a troubling picture. She debated taking it all to the school counselor, but she knew Walt and Melanie would likely talk their way out again unless there was definitive proof. Her mind drifted to Zara, and guilt twisted her heart. Waiting too long might be a problem, yet moving prematurely might achieve nothing. She sighed, shutting her notebook, steeling herself. She would keep watching more closely than ever. She couldn't let this go unaddressed. Do you think Zara should speak up about her foster parents' neglect and abuse? Let everyone know what you think in the comments below. Will anyone believe her, or will Walt and Melanie's lies prevail? Hit the like button if you can't wait to find out, and stay tuned to see if Miss Palmer uncovers the truth in time. Zara sat near the back wall of the cafeteria, a spot usually quieter, working on a plain sandwich she'd tossed together that morning. The midday chaos churned, students laughing, trays rattling, chatter rolling in waves. Her math homework lay open, pencil resting on top, though she wasn't making progress. She only pretended to study. Mind if I sit here? A voice asked, making Zara jump slightly. Glancing up, she saw a girl about her age across the table, sporting a bright grin and an alert glimmer in her eyes, a mixture of confidence and playful curiosity. Zara shrugged, looking back down. Sure. The girl dropped her tray onto the table, sinking into the seat with an exaggerated sigh. This place is wild. I've been here 2 days, and I've already seen 3 arguments and 1 kid basically doze off in PE. You all don't play, do you? Zara didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say to this kind of energy. I'm Lex, the girl continued, undeterred by Zara's silence. She took a large bite of pizza and flicked her gaze toward Zara's homework. Working on math at lunchtime, huh? You're making the rest of us look bad. Zara felt the corners of her mouth twitch into the faintest smile, though she kept her gaze lowered. It's due next period. Fair enough, Lex said, leaning back in the chair. So, do you usually sit by yourself, or am I ruining your alone time? Zara hesitated, then shrugged. I like the quiet, that's all. Lex nodded thoughtfully, like she was stashing that bit of info away. Quiet is cool. I get it. She paused for a moment. I'm new and still figuring out the friend groups here. You seem nice. Mind if I eat here again tomorrow? Zara blinked, momentarily unsure. Typically, people avoided her or teased her. Sure, she mumbled. Awesome, Lex said, flashing a grin. Guess I found my lunch, pal. Over the next few days, Lex showed up at Zara's table faithfully, chattering about everything, her old school, funny movies, and her general disdain for cafeteria food. Zara hardly spoke, but that didn't seem to matter. Lex filled the silence on her own. One afternoon during PE, they were assigned as partners for a basketball drill. Zara was clearly uneasy, barely managing a clumsy dribble. Meanwhile, Lex bounced the ball confidently from hand to hand. At one point, Lex passed the ball to Zara, but her eyes lingered on Zara's wrist. Hey, Lex said, frowning. What happened there? Zara glanced down. She realized, too late, that her sleeve had ridden up, revealing a faint bruise. She yanked the fabric down instantly. It's nothing. I just bumped into something. Lex cocked her head, unconvinced. Right? Sure it's nothing? It is, Zara insisted, turning away and snatching the ball. Lex decided not to press her but remained curious. She recognized the telltale signs. Kids at past foster homes she'd been in often dodged questions like that. That afternoon, they walked home together under the waning sun, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk. Lex had her backpack slung over one shoulder, matching Zara's pace. You don't talk a lot, do you? she remarked casually. Zara shrugged. Not really. Lex smirked a little. That's okay. I talk enough for two people anyway. They walked in silence for a moment before Lex's tone shifted to something more serious. You know, I used to be in foster care too. Zara's eyes flicked toward her, intrigued. Yeah, Lex continued, nudging a small pebble with her foot. Some places were fine, some were pretty bad. There was this one home, super smiley in public, but at home? A total nightmare. Zara looked away, shoulders stiffening. Lex sighed, her voice quiet now. I figured nobody would believe me. Who listens to a foster kid, right? But then a teacher of mine picked up on it, kind of like Miss Palmer. She asked me stuff, I finally told her everything, and it freaked me out. But honestly, it was the best move I ever made. Zara didn't answer, but Lex knew she was listening. Look, I'm not saying it's the same, Lex went on quickly, just that there are people who actually care. Teachers, social workers, friends. You shouldn't keep it all bottled up. Zara's jaw tensed, and she gave a slight shake of the head. You don't understand. Walt and Melanie can convince anyone of anything. No one would ever believe me. Lex's voice was steady but empathetic. I do understand. I've been there. But you're not alone. If you need someone, I'm here. And if you decide to tell Miss Palmer or someone else, I'll back you up. Fear and uncertainty flooded Zara. After a long pause, she said softly, I'm not ready, not yet. Lex nodded. That's okay. I'll be around whenever you decide. For the first time in ages, Zara felt a fragile spark of hope kindle within her. That evening, perched on her bed, her mind replayed Lex's words. She pulled out the worn photo of her biological family from beneath her pillow, fingertips tracing the ragged edges. Maybe Lex was onto something, maybe there really were people who cared. But that didn't stop the worry trembling inside her. For now, she'd take each day as it came, at least knowing she had someone in her corner. That night's dinner was quiet, aside from the light clink of utensils against plates. Zara kept her head bowed, prodding at the overcooked chicken Melanie had prepared. Walt occupied the seat at the head, eyes glued to his phone, barely speaking. Melanie fussed over the tidiness of the house, muttering about cleaning up. Zara, she said curtly, when you're done, I want you to clear the table and wipe down the counters. Yes, ma'am, Zara replied, barely looking up. As soon as the dishes were cleared, Walt and Melanie left her alone in the kitchen. Zara carefully piled the dishes in the sink, taking great pains not to make a sound, scrubbing them in a practiced rhythm while her thoughts drifted to Lex's words. There are people who care. You don't have to keep everything to yourself. The idea felt distant and unattainable. She grabbed a cloth to wipe the counters, but her elbow nudged a fragile vase perched at the edge. It toppled, shattering with a sharp crash. Zara froze, heart dropping into her stomach. What was that? Walt's voice bellowed from the living room. Zara scrambled for the broken shards, her hands shaking, but before she could gather them up, Walt stalked in, Melanie close behind. Walt's face darkened the second he saw the debris. Are you kidding me? He roared, voice reverberating off the walls. Do you know how expensive that was? I'm sorry, Zara managed, her voice wavering. She stared at the floor, palms full of porcelain shards. Sorry doesn't fix a thing, Walt snapped, anger boiling in each syllable. You're nothing but clumsy and... Melanie stepped in, hands raised. Walt, it's just a vase. Let it go. Let it go. Walt snarled, swinging toward her. You think my stress levels aren't high enough? Now this girl can't even handle one simple task. Melanie hesitated, shooting Zara a fleeting look that suggested she might defend her, but then her face hardened. Zara, you really have to be more cautious. We don't have time for mistakes, she said coldly. Zara tried to apologize again, but Walt seized her arm, jerking her upright. Pain lanced up her arm, making her wince. You'd better straighten up, girl, Walt growled, his face inches from hers. Because if you screw up again, you'll face real consequences. Understand? Zara nodded quickly, heart drumming against her ribs. Walt released her with a shove, causing her to stumble back, clinging to her arm. He turned and stomped off, Melanie trailing after him. Zara fled to her room, closing the door gently behind her. She sank onto the bed, eyes locked on the faint red imprint on her arm. She'd forced back tears all evening, but now they poured down her cheeks. Pulling out a torn photo of her birth family, the edges frayed, a rip down the center, she ran a finger over her mother's bright grin and her father's steady presence. "Why can't I just be with you?" she whispered, her voice crumbling. She sobbed, body shaking. As the night stretched on, Zara lay awake, her mind turning over the scene in the kitchen endlessly. Finally, as she began drifting toward uneasy sleep, hushed voices from downstairs made her sit up again, heart hammering. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against it. Walt's tone was low, tinged with smugness. "Yeah, it's easy money," he said. "All you have to do is play the part, keep the kid under control, and the checks keep coming." Not exactly difficult. Zara's stomach turned to ice. She heard Melanie's worried murmur. "We can't have another visit from the school. You need to make sure she stays quiet." Zara backed up, breathing ragged, and crawled back into bed. His words crashed around in her mind. Nobody will believe a foster kid. The next morning, Zara arrived at school exhausted. She drifted through her classes, her mind stuck on the previous night. At lunch, she spotted Lex already at their usual table. "Hey," Lex said, the instant she noticed Zara's face. "What's wrong?" Zara took a deep breath, then shook her head. "Everything," she said finally. "Last night, Walt got mad, grabbed me, screamed at me, and I overheard him telling Melanie they're just using me for money. They don't care about me at all." Her voice broke and she turned away. Lex's cheerful vibe melted into fierce determination. "Zara, you have to tell someone. Miss Palmer, the counselor, anyone. You can't keep it to yourself." Zara shook her head quickly. "I can't. They'll just lie. Walt says no one would believe me anyway." "That's ridiculous," Lex said flatly. "Miss Palmer already thinks something's up. If you tell her what you just told me, she'll do something." Worry and doubt jostled inside Zara. "What if that just makes it worse?" "It won't," Lex said quietly, but with conviction. "You deserve better than this." Zara stared at the tabletop, tears blurring her vision. At last, she nodded a little. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll talk to her." Lex's smile was gentle. She laid a supportive hand on Zara's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. I'm with you." That afternoon, Zara's heart thudded as she walked toward Miss Palmer's classroom. She had no clue what Walt and Melanie might do if they found out, but she couldn't keep quiet anymore. The corridors were almost empty, only faint echoes of voices down distant halls. Zara clutched her backpack so hard her knuckles ached, mind spinning with 100 what-ifs. What if Miss Palmer doubted her? Or if this only fueled Walt's anger? When she reached the door, she paused. Inside, Miss Palmer was busy at her desk, sorting papers, seemingly calm and composed, with no idea of Zara's turmoil. Summoning all her nerve, Zara tapped lightly on the frame. Miss Palmer looked up, a soft smile appearing. "Zara, come on in." "What's up?" Zara stepped inside, stiffly. She scanned the room, checking if they were alone, then shifted on her feet. "You need to talk," she managed, voice quivering. Miss Palmer came around the desk, pulling up a chair. "Okay," she said quietly. "Take your time. Whatever's on your mind, I'm listening." Zara nodded, swallowing as though her throat were sandpaper. "It's Walt and Melanie," she began, voice shaking. "They're not who they seem." Miss Palmer tilted her head, concern etched on her face. "What do you mean?" Words tumbled out, a torrent of pent-up fear. "At home, they shout a lot. Walt grabbed my arm last night. He bruised it because I broke something. Then he said if I screwed up again, there'd be real consequences. They're so sweet in front of others, but at home, they don't care. Walt only talks about money. I heard him on the phone, laughing about how easy it is to get foster care money. He said no one would believe me anyway." Miss Palmer's features grew more empathetic. "Zara, I'm so sorry. You shouldn't be treated like this." Zara carefully pushed her sleeve up, showing a faint red mark. "He did this last night?" Then she let the sleeve drop. "I don't have evidence, though. I just remember what happened and overheard them." Miss Palmer leaned in, her voice resolute. "Your words are important, Zara. Everything you've just told me matters, and I promise to take it seriously." You're not alone. For the first time in a while, Zara felt her shoulders ease a fraction. Okay, she whispered. The next day, Miss Palmer reported what Zara had said directly to the school counselor, who immediately got in touch with Zara's caseworker. A home visit was scheduled for that afternoon. Miss Palmer hoped this marked the beginning of a real change for Zara, but a sense of dread still weighed on her. When the caseworker arrived at Walt and Melanie's, the couple had prepared thoroughly. The living room shone, every surface gleaming. Zara sat on the couch, her expression carefully blank. Walt greeted the visitor with a practiced grin, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice drenched in sincerity. "We've been worried about Zara. She's had trouble fitting in here, but we're trying our best." Melanie nodded, adopting a saccharine sweetness. "Oh yes, Zara's a wonderful child, but she's endured so much. It breaks my heart seeing her struggle." They fielded the caseworker's questions with smooth, patient answers. When she turned to Zara, asking if she felt safe, Walt glared at her, subtle but unmistakable. Zara's fingers dug into the couch cushion as she answered softly, "Yes." The caseworker noted it down and left after another 15 minutes. The instant the door closed, Walt's false smile dropped. He faced Zara, voice like steel. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," Zara squeaked. "I didn't say anything." "You'd better not have," Walt snapped. "You think you can make us look bad? You should be grateful we let you stay here. You'd be nothing on your own." Zara retreated to her room, hands shaking as she sank onto the bed. The following day, Miss Palmer saw how pale Zara looked, how defeated her eyes were. At lunchtime, she pulled Zara aside, speaking softly. "How did the visit go?" Zara's voice wavered as she answered, "They convinced her everything's fine." She bought their act. Miss Palmer's jaw tightened, though she kept calm for Zara's sake. "Don't lose hope. The truth comes out eventually. I'm not giving up on you, and neither should you." Zara's eyes held both dread and a fragile flicker of faith. She had no idea what would happen next, but Miss Palmer's quiet reassurance kept her going. The mood at Walt and Melanie's shifted in the days after. The usual insults gave way to a menacing hush, as if they anticipated more scrutiny. Early one morning, Zara sensed something was off the moment she awoke. Downstairs, Walt and Melanie sat at the dining table, murmuring low. "They're watching," Melanie muttered, voice taut with stress. "We can't risk another surprise. That girl's going to wreck everything." "Let them watch," Walt said, a chill in his words. "We'll control the narrative like always. I've called our lawyer. He'll paint her as a troubled kid, emotional issues, behavior problems, anything to discredit her." Zara's heart pounded as she slunk back to her room, quietly closing the door. They were already spinning lies, framing her as the troublemaker before she even had a chance to act. Over the next days, they went into full-on damage control. Walt called up neighbors and church friends, weaving a story of a patient, loving couple grappling with a difficult foster daughter. "Zara's been through a lot," he'd say with carefully measured concern, "and we just want to help her." Melanie, meanwhile, acted the doting mother in public, draping an arm around Zara, calling her sweet nicknames, even bringing cookies to her class. Teachers and other parents praised her. But behind closed doors, Walt's cold hostility deepened, and Melanie's sugary veneer vanished. They took away Zara's few privileges: no TV, barely enough food, confined to her room except for chores and school. They also scrutinized her every step, rifling her backpack and pockets. One evening, Walt barged into Zara's room unannounced, yanking open drawers. "What are you doing?" Zara asked, her voice trembling. "Making sure you're not hiding anything," Walt snapped, tossing clothes onto the floor. Finding nothing, he stalked out with a warning. "Don't pull anything stupid." Zara sat on the bed, staring at the mess left behind, the walls feeling like they were caving in. She clutched the creased photo of her birth parents, the only possession they hadn't found. How long could she stand this? Their tactics went beyond home, too. Walt tracked down Lex's parents, showing up at their doorstep one evening. The next day, Lex told Zara about it during lunch, face dark with anger. "My dad said Walt came by last night," Lex explained. "Told them you're making everything up, that you're trouble, telling lies." Zara's stomach sank. "What did your parents say?" They're on your side, Lex answered firmly. They've seen enough to believe me. But be careful, Walt wants you isolated. Zara nodded, her throat tight. I already feel isolated. Every time I push back, they clamp down harder. Lex squeezed Zara's shoulder gently. That's their plan, scare you so you'll stay quiet. Don't let them. Ms. Palmer's still fighting for you, yeah? Zara nodded again, though doubt gnawed at her. What if it isn't enough? What if no one believes her either? They will, Lex said with absolute conviction. Just hang in there. You're not alone. Still, the strain weighed on Zara. Though each school day was a respite, the instant she returned home, the fear closed in. She grew increasingly withdrawn. Miss Palmer saw the change immediately, pulling Zara aside after class one afternoon. Zara, you're not yourself lately. Are you okay? She asked gently. Zara cast her eyes down. They're watching me, she whispered. They're making me look like a liar. Miss Palmer's lips thinned, but she kept her voice calming. I know it seems that way, but you've already done the bravest thing by speaking out. The truth usually finds a way. Don't lose hope. Zara's gaze flickered with apprehension and a hint of optimism. She had no clue how this would end, but Miss Palmer's unwavering support helped her endure. The notion of a plan formed quietly, sparked by Miss Palmer's and Lex's continued encouragement. Zara realized words alone wouldn't suffice. Walt and Melanie were masters at manipulating a story. She needed proof, unambiguous, solid proof. Sitting in Miss Palmer's classroom after school one day, Zara confessed her idea. I have to show people what they're really like, she said, voice trembling but determined. Otherwise, no one will believe me. Miss Palmer leaned in, concern clear in her eyes. That's a huge step, Zara. It could be risky. Are you sure you're ready? Zara steeled herself, her stomach quivering. I don't have a choice. Her first move involved recording Walt's tirades. She found her old phone, the one he'd confiscated months before, still tucked away. Though outdated, it had a functioning camera and a microphone sensitive enough to pick up audio from across her room. That evening, she hid it on a shelf behind a stack of books and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Walt burst in, face twisted in irritation. Why are the dishes still in the sink, Zara? I said to wash them after dinner. I was about to, Zara murmured, hands shaking. Walt took a menacing step closer, voice dropping. I don't want excuses, girl. You think you can slack off? Not in my house. Zara nodded quickly, head bowed, while the phone quietly captured every word. As days went by, Zara grew bolder. She snapped photos of every bruise, logging them carefully before they faded. Each time, she hid the phone again, terrified they might catch her with it. Lex helped too, acting as a secret ally. At lunch, they'd slip away to a secluded corner outside and discuss their progress. How's it going? Lex asked, speaking under her breath. Zara glanced around. I've got recordings, pictures, but I need something bigger. Lex thought for a moment. What about their finances? Didn't you say Walt's always ranting about money? Zara frowned thoughtfully. He has an office at home with files. Maybe I can look there. That could be major, Lex said. Just be careful. I will, Zara promised, more to calm herself than Lex. That evening, while Melanie cooked and Walt watched TV, Zara sneaked into the office. The space smelled of stale coffee and old leather. She combed through receipts and random paperwork. Her heart hammered. At last, she spotted a folder labeled Finances. She opened it and froze. Bank statements and bills revealed how Walt and Melanie were using the foster care funds, on pricey clothes, fancy meals, even weekend trips. Money meant for Zara was paying for their personal luxuries. Hands trembling, Zara raised her phone and snapped photo after photo. She just shoved the file back when footsteps closed in. Her breath caught. Walt's voice sounded just beyond the door. She panicked, ducking under the desk, phone clutched tightly. The door squeaked open. Walt stepped in, grumbling to himself while grabbing a pen. He paused, scanning the room, then left. Zara waited, heart pounding, until she was sure he was gone. She slipped away, legs quivering, astonished by how close she'd come to discovery. Next morning at school, Zara showed Ms. Palmer the pictures. Ms. Palmer's face hardened with resolve. "This is exactly what we need," she said gravely. "But are you okay?" Zara shrugged, exhaustion written all over her. "I'm holding up." "You're doing something incredibly brave," Miss Palmer said, offering a small but warm smile. "I'll get these to the counselor and add them to the report." Meanwhile, Miss Palmer continued gathering testimonies from other teachers and from Lex, who had witnessed Walt's outbursts. Gradually, they pieced together an unassailable account of what was really happening behind Walt and Melanie's polished public act. At home, though, Walt's suspicion escalated. He prowled through Zara's room, rummaging through every corner, searching for incriminating evidence. One evening, he discovered Zara's backpack open on the floor and rifled through it, finding nothing. His irritation only grew. "You've been acting strange," Walt said at dinner, eyes narrowing. "If you're planning something, cut it out. I won't tolerate defiance." Zara kept her head lowered, picking at her food. She felt Melanie's icy gaze as well, though Melanie didn't speak a word. The constant hostility ground Zara's nerves down. She doubted herself. Could any of this truly help? But each time despair threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered Lex's unwavering presence and Miss Palmer's determined face. She pressed on. One afternoon in the schoolyard, Lex tapped Zara's shoulder. "You're doing great," she said firmly. "They're scared, which is good. Means they know you're on to them." Zara gave a faint nod, weighed down by everything. "I just want it over with." "It will be," Lex answered confidently. "We're close." Zara and Miss Palmer spent extra time finalizing their evidence, fully aware how dangerous Walt and Melanie could become if they sensed how tight the net was drawing. Yet the greater their hostility, the more complete the case appeared. They weren't just amassing proof, they were building real hope. Eventually, the tension hit a breaking point. Weeks of documenting bruises, verbal outbursts, and the financial documents Ms. Palmer had helped compile created a grim but powerful portfolio of Walt and Melanie's disregard and cruelty. Ms. Palmer turned it all over to the counselor, who wasted no time bringing it to Zara's caseworker. This time, the mountain of evidence couldn't be brushed aside. An emergency meeting was scheduled at Walt and Melanie's, attended by the caseworker and a legal representative from child welfare. Walt tried painting himself as a misunderstood foster father, accusing Zara of being ungrateful and emotionally unstable. Melanie pretended to cry, claiming they had done all they could to guide Zara. But, confronted by the recordings of Walt's rants and the financial papers clearly showing misuse of funds, their facade fractured. Walt grew defensive, and Melanie's tears lost their potency. By the meeting's end, the agency decided to request an emergency custody hearing to determine Zara's placement. They informed Walt and Melanie that they were under review, and the court would decide Zara's future. Upon hearing this, Zara experienced a tumult of emotions. Immense relief that she might finally escape, but also sheer anxiety over facing them in court. Ms. Palmer promised to stand by her, and Lex pledged to testify about everything she'd seen. The courtroom felt overwhelmingly large. Zara sat in an uncomfortable wooden chair near the front, her feet dangling just above the floor. She tugged at her ill-fitting sweater sleeves, eyes flicking around the imposing walls, the austere benches, and the stern faces of the attorneys. Miss Palmer sat beside her, hand resting lightly on Zara's shoulder. On her other side, Lex offered an encouraging nod. Across the aisle, Walt and Melanie sat formally, exuding false refinement. Their lawyer, a slick man in a neat suit, had begun his opening statement. "My clients, Walt and Melanie Parker, have done everything to provide a secure and loving home for Zara," he said, gesturing toward them. "Taking on a foster child with a troubled background is no small task, and they've risen to that challenge with patience." Zara's stomach churned. Walt wore a pious expression. Melanie dabbed theatrically at her eyes with a tissue. The lawyer pressed on, blaming any tension on Zara's trauma and misinterpretation of discipline. Claiming Walt and Melanie were the epitome of caring foster parents, he insisted they had done nothing but show compassion. The judge, a steely-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened quietly, showing no emotion. Next, Walt took the stand, adjusting his tie like an actor preparing for a role. "Your Honor," he said, voice quavering with feigned sorrow, "bringing Zara into our home was a blessing. But she's faced so much that she can't always accept our help. We've sacrificed time and money because we love her. It pains me to see her think otherwise." Zara clenched her fists, wanting to protest aloud but too afraid. Melanie followed him, equally melodramatic, saying Zara was practically a daughter, that they'd tried everything to support her. The judge took notes, face impassive, while Zara felt like the walls were closing in. They were so convincing. Would anyone see through it? Finally, the moment came for Zara. Miss Palmer gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze and whispered, "You're brave. Go do this." Zara stood on trembling legs, crossing the room to the witness stand. She climbed into the seat, which seemed enormous, scanning the judge, then Walt and Melanie, who regarded her coldly. The judge spoke gently. "Take your time, Zara. No rush." Zara's throat felt parched. She darted a glance at Miss Palmer and Lex. Miss Palmer offered a soft nod. Lex mouthed, "You got this." Zara drew a breath, then began in a shaky voice. "They're lying," she said, voice faltering but loud enough to hear. "They don't care about me at all. At home, it's nothing like how they act in public." Walt jerked forward in his seat. "That's not," he began, but the judge silenced him with a stern look. "Mr. Parker, remain quiet while Zara speaks." Walt slumped back, glaring. Zara's nerves fluttered, but she pressed on. "They scream at me all the time. They say I'm worthless, and I should be grateful they took me in. Walt grabbed my arm once when he was angry. He bruised it." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a faint mark. "And they only really want the foster money. I overheard Walt on the phone, laughing about it, saying nobody would believe a foster kid." The room stilled as Zara pulled her old phone from her pocket. "I recorded them," she explained, hands quivering as she handed it to a bailiff. "There are recordings of them yelling, pictures of bruises, and I found these papers in Walt's office showing he spends that money on himself." The judge listened to a short recording, her face darkening. Then Lex stepped up to the witness box, explaining what she had seen, Walt roughly dragging Zara into the car, and how Zara told her he pretended kindness only when people looked. The judge took more notes. Lex gave Zara a small, encouraging smile before stepping down. Finally, Miss Palmer presented her compiled notes and statements from other teachers who'd noticed Zara's bruises and withdrawn behavior, along with the evidence of financial exploitation. "Zara should never have had to gather all this herself," Miss Palmer said, her tone measured but firm. "She's shown remarkable courage. The documents speak for themselves. Walt and Melanie Parker have failed to provide the safe, nurturing environment Zara deserves." The judge skimmed through everything, then announced a short recess to deliberate. Zara sank into her seat, exhausted. Miss Palmer and Lex both leaned in, offering quiet reassurance. "You were amazing," Lex said. "You told the truth, that matters." Zara nodded, hands still trembling. Waiting for the verdict felt unbearable. When the judge returned, the hush in the courtroom was stark. Zara gripped the edge of the table, heart pounding. Across from her, Walt sat stiff-backed, fists clenched, while Melanie dabbed at her eyes, face streaked with tears. Clearing her throat, the judge surveyed the room. After reviewing all evidence, testimony from Zara, Lex, Miss Palmer, and the financial records plus audio recordings, the court finds strong evidence of neglect and financial misconduct by Walt and Melanie Parker. An audible gasp rippled around them. Walt's face reddened, and his polished composure started crumbling. He tried to speak, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Parker," she said icily, "you not only shirked your responsibilities as a foster parent, but exploited the system for personal gain, inflicting serious harm on a child who relied on you. This court won't tolerate that." Walt leapt to his feet, voice quivering with rage. "This is absurd. She's lying." "Sit down, Mr. Parker," the judge commanded. Walt all but collapsed, still seething. Her gaze shifted to Melanie, who wept quietly. "Mrs. Parker, your complicity is equally concerning. You enabled the neglect and financial misuse. Whether or not you took the lead, you share the blame." Melanie shook her head, sobbing, "Please, Your Honor, I didn't want." "Enough," the judge interjected. "Effective immediately, Walt Parker, You are under arrest for child neglect and financial fraud. Officers, take him into custody. Two uniformed bailiffs approached Walt, who blustered about his rights but was quickly cuffed and escorted out. Melanie's sobs grew louder. Melanie Parker, the judge continued, you'll remain under investigation and can no longer foster children. Later proceedings will determine your full responsibility. Melanie slumped in her chair, tears echoing in the tense space. Zara watched, feelings colliding inside her. She felt an undeniable sense of relief that Walt and Melanie couldn't harm her anymore, but she also felt hollow. Yet another home lost, if it had ever truly been one. As Walt was led away, Melanie stretched a hand toward Zara, tears trailing down her cheeks. Zara, I'm sorry. I never wanted. Zara recoiled, uncertain what to say. Miss Palmer rested a reassuring hand on Zara's arm and whispered, you don't have to respond. The judge banged her gavel, drawing attention once more. In light of these findings, Zara will be placed with a new foster family. Child welfare has been notified and will expedite this to ensure her well-being. Zara breathed out shakily, relief mixing with anxiety. She glanced at Miss Palmer, who offered a gentle, hopeful smile. This isn't the end, Zara, Miss Palmer murmured softly. It's the beginning of something better. After the courtroom cleared, Zara stayed in her seat, hands gripping the table. A wave of freedom washed over her, but it didn't feel as comforting as she'd imagined. A familiar heaviness settled in her chest, the uncertainty of what came next almost suffocating. Miss Palmer remained at her side, studying her carefully. You were wonderful, Zara, she said gently. You stood up for yourself. That takes real courage. Zara nodded, staring at her hands. So, now what? She asked, voice small. Miss Palmer hesitated a moment. Well, typically, they'd place you with another foster family until everything is straightened out. Zara's shoulders sagged. Another family, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She didn't need to elaborate, the weight of those words spoke for itself. Miss Palmer leaned forward, dropping her voice. Zara, I've been thinking. You've been through more than most adults ever do. You're strong, but you shouldn't have to keep starting over. Zara looked up, puzzled but curious. What do you mean? A gentle smile spread over Miss Palmer's face. I'm asking if you'd like to live with me. Zara blinked in surprise. Miss Palmer nodded softly. It's a big question. I don't expect an answer right this second. But I'd really like to give you the secure home you deserve. A real one. Zara lowered her gaze, heart hammering, disbelief and hope colliding. Do you really mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't, Miss Palmer promised. I know I can't undo the past, but I can make sure it never happens again. I'd be happy to have you. Tears welled up in Zara's eyes. For so long, she'd believed nobody genuinely wanted her, that she was only a burden. But Miss Palmer's words sounded true, unlike anything she'd heard before. I think I'd like that, she whispered, voice trembling. Miss Palmer laid a hand over Zara's gently, eyes bright with emotion. Then let's make it happen, step by step. Days later, Zara found herself standing on the threshold of Miss Palmer's home, backpack hanging from one shoulder. The house glowed with warmth, soft yellow walls, shelves of books, framed family pictures. The smell of fresh cookies drifted from somewhere inside. A girl around Zara's age with shoulder-length blonde hair popped into the hallway, wearing a sunny orange sweater that seemed to match her energetic expression. Hi, you must be Zara, she said, extending her hand. I'm Ella, Miss Palmer's daughter. Zara stood still for a moment before shaking the offered hand, voice quiet. It's I. Ella beamed. Mom's been talking about you nonstop. She even made chocolate chip cookies, her best recipe. You'll love them. Before Zara could respond, a man with sandy hair and a kind face arrived, drying his hands on a dish towel. Welcome, Zara, he greeted, holding out his own hand. I'm Drew, Ella's dad. Good to have you here. Zara glanced at Miss Palmer, uncertain. Miss Palmer gave an encouraging nod. Come on, let's get you settled. Miss Palmer led her to a small but cozy room. Light green walls, a soft bed, a patchwork quilt. A little desk by the window. A framed school photo of Zara sat on the desk. She stared at it, confused at how it had gotten there. I wanted it to feel like your space, Miss Palmer said quietly, watching Zara's reaction. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to add. Nice, Zara said, placing her backpack on the bed. Ella leaned casually in the doorway, an easy grin on her face. Tell me if you need anything. Just a heads up, though, Dad's way too intense when it comes to board games, and I'm the reigning champ. From somewhere in the house, Drew's voice called out, Don't believe her, she cheats. Zara surprised herself by giving a small laugh. I don't really know how to play board games. That's okay, Ella said cheerily. We'll teach you. That evening, Miss Palmer found Zara on the porch, where the night sky sparkled with stars. How are you feeling? She asked softly. Zara took a moment to think. Different, she answered, but not bad. Miss Palmer smiled. Different can be wonderful. You're part of our family now, me, Ella, and Drew. You're not alone. Zara nodded, her chest tightening with a new emotion. Thank you, she whispered. Later, gazing out at the stars from her new bed, Zara's heart felt lighter, freer. So this is what safe might feel like, she murmured. The house was calm, full of a quiet warmth and promise. For the first time in forever, Zara believed she might just have found where she belonged. Thanks for reading all the way through. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe for more.